Welcome to the first virtual research convening of the Center for Victim Research. My name is Mallory Dusenberry, and I'm part of the Center for Victim Research team at the Urban Institute, where I conduct victimization-focused research and technical assistance as a policy associate. Today, we'll be discussing how research has or could be used to capture victims' voices on justice, and how that research can inform policy and practice. If you're not familiar with the Center for Victim Research, we are a national resource center that aims to bring victim researchers and practitioners together to improve response to victims across the country. We offer extensive research-focused library, original tools and technical assistance to support research, and victimization-specific research syntheses. But we also foster collaboration between researchers and practitioners through a searchable researcher directory that currently has over 350 members and counting. So please join if you're not already in it. And we highlight those partnerships through fellowships, podcasts, and webinars. CVR itself is a joint venture between researchers and practitioners at 3 different organizations: the Justice Research and Statistics Association, the National Center for Victims of Crime, and the Urban Institute. So I'd like to pause here briefly and thank our funder for their ongoing support, the Office for Victims of Crime, and give this standard disclaimer that all opinions and findings discussed today are our own. So before we dive in, I want to do a little bit of framing. I think we can all agree that a primary goal of practitioners and victim researchers alike is for systems and responses to work for all crime victims, meaning to do no additional harm, to contribute to recovery and empowerment, and to meet the diverse needs of victims. But we also know that victims are not a monolithic group, so this is a very significant challenge, especially given the complexity of all of our systems. Research plays an essential role in illuminating whether these systems and responses are working, and critically for whom. Victim research has long sought to give voice to victims' experiences and needs. Many researchers, including many of you here that I'm so thrilled to see, have worked very hard to illuminate victims' perspectives of the criminal justice system and whether victims feel that it provides justice. But we also know that the traditional justice system is not the only approach to dealing with harm, crime, accountability, etc. Current events especially have renewed conversations about alternative models and forms of justice. These may include procedural, restorative, and transformative or transitional justice. For those of you who might be less familiar with some of these topics, while the traditional justice system tends to be more perpetrator-focused, some of these social justice-focused alternatives, such as restorative justice, for example, is about repairing the harm caused by a crime as determined by the victim, offender, community members all together. And the more progressive but still somewhat theoretical transformative justice goes even a step further and tries to involve whole communities and make changes to prevent future harms. So our community of victim researchers and practitioners can contribute substantially to these important debates by elevating victims' voices and working to fill gaps in knowledge that might exist on certain types of victimization, certain crime populations, and certain models of justice. So today we hope to share some of the exciting research that is being done and facilitate thoughtful discussion as a large group, as well as in smaller breakout groups about strategies to engage in and utilize this kind of work. So to accomplish these goals, we're beginning with a panel discussion with 3 researchers representing diverse victim experiences and perspectives. We'll then give a substantial amount of time for you to ask questions of the panelists through the chat box. Next will be an opportunity to join small breakout groups to share your work, meet other researchers and practitioners, and discuss the topics further. These sessions, as I mentioned, will be led by expert discussants and co-facilitated by CVR staff. We'll then reconvene and conclude by presenting key takeaways from the day and share some CVR resources. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our panelists of the day. I'm very pleased to be joined by 3 outstanding researchers who have a wealth of experience on these topics. Dr. Carolyn West is a professor of psychology at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Her work focuses on domestic and sexual violence, particularly as experienced by Black women, and how professionals can provide culturally sensitive services. Dr. Jeanette Huseman is a principal research associate at the Urban Institute, where she researches indigent defense, victimization, and juvenile justice. She's the principal investigator of the NIJ-funded study Perceptions of Justice that captured the voices of human trafficking survivors. And Dr. Henrika McCoy is an associate professor of social work at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Since 2016, she has worked as the principal investigator of the NIJ-funded Survive study, understanding the violent victimization experiences of young men of color. So I'm going to leave it at that and ask Jennifer to stop sharing her screen for our discussion. So I want to start by asking each of these panelists to describe their work and how they've used research to capture victim voices, particularly with regards to different systems of justice. Henrika, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to see everyone's here from so many places around the country. I tried to take a few notes so I would make a point of not forgetting what I wanted to say. I'll focus on the Survive project, which Mallory brought up. It was a project that we were really fortunate to have the opportunity to conduct. And the idea behind the project was that young Black men between the ages of 18 to 24, which is our population, is most impacted by violence, but actually has the least amount of research that's conducted about their experiences. And so we wanted to think about not only kind of having research conducted about that population, but to try to provide resources for other people to be able to do that. And so our approach was to spend the time creating an instrument that could also be used in research and practice to be able to kind of move that forward that would be easily accessible. And so we did this over multiple phases. It was a two-phase project. It was a nationwide project. And I'll say we had some changes along the way because we listened to the participants that were in our study. So initially our study focused only on having young men be participants. And we were lucky in that we got this project, and the Chicago Defender, which is a historical Black newspaper in Chicago, picked up the story and it ran it as their front page news story. And within 2 hours of running that story, we got a phone call from someone who read the story and wanted to be on the project. And it was a Black man who had read it, really connected, and wanted to be involved in any way that he could. And so ultimately he became a really important part of our project in terms of kind of our lead trainer, lead interviewer, etc. And what also happened because of that story is that we had women calling who wanted to be engaged in the project, and we hadn't considered that. And so ironically, as a Black woman, it hadn't actually occurred to me that we should maybe ask Black women too what they thought about this. And so I bring that up because part of it is thinking about how do you capture voices, and that there are many voices related to these types of experiences. So what we did was have across these multiple phases, the majority of young Black men, but also Black women. So we had initially with Black men, we kind of went into it with the research of thinking about what the topic areas were that we wanted to focus on. But beyond that, we thought about, what are the actual categories that are important and what research exists. So we came up with these kind of general broad categories. And then we had young men from around the state of Illinois come together and give us their feedback. And ironically, I'm in Chicago. Ironically, when you look at research, Illinois is pretty demographically akin to a nationwide distribution. So we were fortunate that we could use Illinois as our test point. So we had focus groups kind of throughout the state, and we hired only Black men to do the work. So our team, I'll say, was made up of myself, 2 white women, and a white male. And so because of that, we felt it was important that the people that were on the ground doing the work and informing us were Black men who looked like the participants. So we had focus groups throughout the state, and we provided to them, okay, these are our ideas. This is what we think we should be asking, these kinds of categories. What do you think? Tell us what we've missed, tell us what's wrong, tell us what we should change. And then we took that same information to women since we'd gotten those questions. So we had key informant meetings with 2 groups of Black women in Chicago. And these were women who had to be either sisters, mothers, granddaughters, children, aunts, etc., over the age of 18. And the only criteria was that they had a relationship with a man who fit the criteria of someone in our study. And so it was very interesting for us because often what came out was that many of the experiences that young men identified were important, women did too, but there were also experiences that women identified were important that men had minimized. So that was really important information for us because it encouraged us to think about additional categories that we wanted to explore that we might have missed had we not explored kind of beyond just the young men in our study, the information that we needed to know. So we used those focus groups to come up with what the important questions were, what the categories were. Beyond that, we kind of asked some experts in the field, including Black men who'd done research in the area, what did they think? We then kind of created these categories in our questions. We did what's called cognitive interviewing with young Black men, which was having them then review the questions and tell us how they understood them, the actual language that needed to be changed, and then we made all those changes. And then we launched the study nationwide. And we had all of our interviewers come in to do training. The idea was that they had to be Black men, ideally with some experience also akin to what we were looking for in our participants, and that they were going to be interviewing people in their areas and in their neighborhoods. And I'll just give one example of why that worked so well. We had a young man who came to the focus group and we asked, well, why did you come? And he said, well, I figured if he could come and stand on the corner at the bus stop and ask me, he thought I was important enough that I should come and tell everyone else what was important. And so, you know, I tell that story often because I think it reflects people think it's hard to get participants, but it's not if you demonstrate that you care and that you think their opinions are important. And we made a very concerted effort to do that because we wanted to make sure that their voices were captured, not our interpretation of their voices. So I'll stop there. I think I have about 5 minutes. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Enrique. That's so wonderful to hear. And I imagine there's lots of agreement out there as well. Jeanette, would you like to go next? We'd love to hear from you about your study.
Oh yeah, thanks Mallory. And Henrique, I loved hearing about your study. That was like the community engaged methods approach there is awesome. And just want to say I love seeing everybody from across the country. It's exciting. This is a great topic. I just wanted to step back and say that originally how I came into this work is kind of through the court system, and I've been doing justice work and perceptions of justice work and experiences of justice work for, gosh, like over a decade now for sure. And that really started in the courts, and just interviewing individuals going through the court system and talking with so many so many victims who are unidentified as victims, right? We have a lot of defendants and individuals who go through the court system who, once you start to talk with them, you realize they have experienced victimization. And that's really where my research on justice started. I was talking with individuals about their court experiences with plea bargaining, just decision making, and just how they really thought about that experience and about justice and fairness in their case. And through that interview process, which ended up turning into my dissertation, I just met so many victims and started to hear about how the intersection of those experiences really, came into play with how they were experiencing the courts and how they were perceiving the outcomes and the justice, their perceptions of justice in their case. And so that really has moved me into, I came to Urban about 8 years ago, and I really started working a lot more on victimization issues. I do elder abuse work, interpersonal violence work, and then I think the project that Mallory referred to is a human trafficking project. I do quite a bit of human trafficking work, but this was a project that was really conceived of. I have to give props to a colleague that used to be with us, Colleen Owens, and then a friend of mine here, Lisa Palumbo at Legal Aid Chicago, who's a civil legal worker or lawyer here in Chicago, who was really wanted to take a step back and think about how individuals, human trafficking survivors in particular, think about justice in their cases. And so we went into that project pretty much with just a couple of really key questions in mind. And that was, how are human trafficking survivors experiencing social services and experiencing the justice system? What are their perceptions of justice in their cases? And then what are alternatives, what kind of alternatives are survivors looking for? And so what are alternative forms of justice? And we were exactly what, Mallory, what you were talking about. We were really looking at restorative justice, procedural justice, and transitional justice. And so We went into the field. We worked across 8 sites. We interviewed 80 survivors of labor and sex trafficking. Although it was much more on the sex trafficking side, our sample is biased. And then we also talked to about 100 legal and social services stakeholders. And we came away from that project with so much input and a lot of findings, and I can talk about them, I think, you know, in our breakout sessions, and I think probably with some of the other questions you're going to pose as well, Mallory. But it was a really great discussion that we had with survivors out there in the field, and just like rethinking what justice looks like in those cases, and just kind of with the key finding that, you know, retribution, you know, like their usual criminal justice focus that we are always thinking about of pushing cases through the courts, and then jail and prison is not always the best route, and is not always what survivors or individuals who have been victimized is looking for in their cases.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeanette. Carolyn, would you like to tell us about your work?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. As I was thinking about this particular presentation, I just realized that my work has just in some ways been all over the map. So it's been an interesting career in many ways. And I'd have to say a couple of pivotal things brought me to this work. I think at 13 years old, I got my first adult library card. And the first book I checked out was Scream Quietly or The Neighbors Will Hear. And it was one of the first academic sort of investigations of domestic violence. And that's where I was introduced to the work of Murray Strauss and the first family violence surveys and the conflict tactic scale. And I also found an entry for clinical psychologists in the World Book of Encyclopedias. So that kind of set me on the path to doing this work. And probably the second thing that really did it for me was during my graduate program, working with low-income young people in inner city St. Louis, and seeing a lot of dating violence and not being able to find research on how to really understand what was making them so at risk, and then deciding to just do my dissertation on that topic. And then the third thing that really sealed the deal for me was going to do my second postdoc at the University of New Hampshire with Murray Strauss, ironically, working in his lab for a couple of years, and realizing that there wasn't a body of literature that really dealt with the most marginalized populations, and their voices didn't really seem to be getting heard in the research. And I just knew that I had to work to spend my career compiling the research in a way that would work well in getting access to that information. So those are probably the pivotal points that brought me to this work. So how I've really shaped my career now is, I'll talk about specific projects maybe later, but in terms of what I have done in my career to bring the voices of victims to this work, a couple of things I've done is to do really large systematic reviews of the research. It's important to me to bring all of the research together that's sort of spread out in one place, that activists and advocates and other researchers can use it. I work a lot with national organizations. One large project we worked on was talking to domestic violence advocates and activists all across the country, particularly activists of color, and saying, hey, what's not working in the field, and what can we do to help make the field more culturally sensitive and responsive. Another thing, I do a lot of technical reports. That's really important to me, to do technical reports and to translate the research in ways that real people who aren't steeped in the research can read it and understand it. And more applied research is important to me. Expert witness work has been hugely important to me, because I feel like I can go into a courtroom and I can speak on behalf of of survivors who don't have a voice in that setting. Being a professor and teaching courses on sexual violence and family violence, I'm on a mission to create a multicultural alliance of people who could go out and do this work. And I do that by being an educator. And I think probably the final example off the top of my head is just doing documentary films now, to be creative about bringing the research all together in one place that people can use it in some interesting creative ways. So throughout my career, I've just done a variety of things to amplify the voices of survivors. And I'll talk about specific projects later.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carolyn. I love hearing about the diversity of work that you're doing. It's fascinating. It's so exciting. And I love that you mentioned kind of making research accessible and translating it to be useful for everybody. That's so critical and a big part of what CVR's mission is as well. We do a lot of work synthesizing all of that big research on one specific topic, because it's so spread out and hard to find and hard to understand what it's all saying and if it's contradictory. And so very important work. So we thank you for that. And thank all three of you for the exciting work that you're doing. It's fascinating. My second question is actually going back to kind of that training others to do this kind of work and encouraging others to do this kind of work. So my question is, what advice would you give other researchers trying to do this work of elevating victims' voices, particularly with justice? In the meantime, we'd love to hear on the chat from the researchers in the audience about how you're doing this kind of work already, if you are. So let's start with Jeanette. What kind of advice do you have for everybody?
Yeah, I was gonna, I think you said it just right, Mallory, about how the disseminating and how you do that is really important. But I was also thinking about this question and just being victim-centered and how you approach the research generally with working with survivors in particular. I know we've had to be really thoughtful about that. And so I was thinking about it from a methodological standpoint a little bit, because I'm a researcher, and and so I guess I had just 3 pieces of advice in how we approach the research and for others. And so one key thing we always do, or I always try to do, is not to ask the survivors or victims to retell their story all the time. And unless it's imperative for the research or what you're trying to do as what you're trying to get from them. And unless they're really interested in telling you their story, something we try not to do is to ask them to retell that story. And then one thing is that we've always found that was really important is to make sure that individual is in a good place to be, in a good place to talk, or in a good place to be a part of the research or to participate in the study. So working with service providers has been a key to collaborating with service providers has been a key to success for research for us, and just having good communication, that good research service provider collaboration and good communication regarding if they're helping recruit survivors or victims, here, or please help make sure that the individuals we're connecting with are in a good place in their healing, and that an experience of coming to the table and sitting down and talking with us is not going to be re-traumatizing, and that they understand the purpose of this research and are in a good place in their healing process to sit down and talk with us. And then one thing I always is, I like to think about too, and encourage others to think about, because I think there's a huge lack of research, longitudinal research, particularly in the trafficking world, is that feelings, goals, needs, perceptions change over time and among survivors. So I know a lot of the people we spoke with, what they articulated about in particular about how they perceived justice, immediately following coming out of a situation can look a lot different than a year down the road. And We hear that from service providers all the time, that even maybe like, although an individual coming out of a situation may not want to pursue that criminal justice response at the moment, and they just may want to focus on healing, that a year down the road, that goal may look different and what they perceive as justice may change. And I think that's an important thing we're not really looking at or thinking about. The justice system isn't right now, and we also lack a lot of research on that moving forward. But otherwise, I was just gonna say, like, we always try to like make the survivor feel comfortable, like be really approachable, offer food, meet them where they want to, and yeah, just be nice, I guess.
That's wise words for life in general.
Yeah, right? Let's all just be nice.
And I love your point about collaborating with service providers, since I know we have a ton of practitioners today as well. So wonderful. Carolyn, what wisdom do you have to share with everybody?
Okay, so I thought about this, and I'll just leave you with 3 quotes that have meant a lot to me. I've got in honor of John Lewis and his passing, I just thought about his quote. Actually, I should probably just read my shirt here. Never ever be afraid to make noise and to get into good trouble, necessary trouble. That has inspired me throughout my career. When I think about well before the Me Too movement, and sexual harassment was always a thing, we didn't talk about that in graduate programs. And I remember complaining to my graduate program, and then later, not just complaining, but filing a lawsuit in federal court for sexual harassment against the universities. They don't like that when you do that, by the way. But in saying, I am going to not only use this experience to inspire my own research, but to do radio shows, interviews, media appearances, and educate people as much as I can about sexual assault and domestic violence and all forms of violence, and just raise awareness. But I think my most important advice is to bring your whole self to the work. I think sometimes as researchers, it's very easy to sort of hide behind the research and not really be visible and share our own experiences. So I don't think that you can do this work really authentically unless you really show up. My second piece of advice is Toni Morrison. If there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. So instead of complaining about that I wasn't finding the literature that I wanted to find, then set about creating the literature that I want. I write the books that I want to read. And so just create what you want to see in the research. And probably the third piece of advice is from Audre Lorde. I've come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised and misunderstood. And so being okay with the fact that sometimes that's just going to happen, but I've got to be okay with that and speak as clearly and as authentically as I can, and to be verbal about the things that matter most to me, because they also matter to a lot of other people. So those are my 3 big takeaways.
Those are great quotes. Love that wisdom. Thank you for sharing. All right, Henrika, what advice do you have for researchers out there today?
So I have 3 kind of different things. The first one is, be prepared to defend your work and don't be afraid to challenge people about the stereotypes and erroneous thinking that they have about your participants. We experienced this quite a bit with everyone from the IRB and people in the community, et cetera, because the study was about young Black men and violence. And the assumption, we got questions like, are you going to separate the gang members in your focus groups? Are you going to check them for guns at the door, et cetera? And we had to repeatedly say, just because it's a study about young Black men doesn't mean that that's what we need to prepare for. The point of this study is that young Black men, period, experience violence, no matter who you are. because you are a young Black man. And it's interesting now in the day that we're having in this age right now, because this was not the conversation that was being had, 4 or 5 years ago when we got the funding for this. But we had to consistently say to people, excuse me, and confront people about that. And when we first got this study, I was an assistant professor. I hadn't gotten tenure yet. And so I'm like having this fight with people thinking, please don't hold this against me. I want to keep my job, which may sound crazy, but, when you're going against the powers that be, it's a real feeling. And so I had to fight that. And so don't be afraid to do that. It was more important to me that the people whose voices I wanted to have shared had their voices shared accurately than anything else. And that I had to remind people that being young, Black, and male creates the opportunity for you to be victimized no matter what. And that the other piece was that our study was not just about young Black men engaged in any sort of, negative behavior. We had people who had college degrees or in graduate school who had been incarcerated, who had never been incarcerated, who were working for, well-known companies, et cetera. But what they all had in common is that they had experienced victimization of some sort. So that's one of my key pieces, is be prepared to defend and feel firm about it and be strong about it and believe in what you're saying. Because I felt very strongly about the fact that these were young men whose voices needed to be shared. And I was not going to let them be shared under the guise of a negative perception that was just not true. I would say the second thing I noticed in the chat, Debbie Dean said more studies should include military. And so I just want to throw this out. It's also important, I think, to think deeply and not just broadly about your participants. We had a section about military violence, and the assumption automatically was that military violence meant sexual assault, and that was not our intention. That was important. But what we really meant was that we know that for some young Black men who enter the military, which can be a common way for people to leave neighborhoods or because of historical family engagement in the military, but they may be entering the military having experienced violence themselves, and then going into an environment where then they are being paid, quote unquote, to experience violence yet again. And then no one cares about that. And then maybe returning to an environment where there is violence. And so we were really interested in trying to make sure that those stories were heard, because those stories are never heard, they're never talked about. And it's an important narrative to hear. And so I wanted to throw that out because Debbie brought that up, that overall, think deeply, not just broadly when you think about what your categories are and what it is you're interested in, because there's so many untold narratives that people don't think about that fit what people assume. And we had men in our study who were in the military, and we had to say, oh no, that's not what we mean. We mean this other thing. And then they're like, oh, well, sure, I can talk about that. So we asked, what was your experience in the military? How did that feel? You had other experiences. What was that like? But there were also young men who had been in the military who had not had experiences of violence before then. And they felt validated that we cared about their military experiences with violence. So I wanted to throw that out. And I think just the last thing, is to make sure you house your research in the community. I mentioned that we hired people to do the work in their communities. And part of our work with community partners was we had our interviews and focus groups conducted at the Salvation Army, at the local youth group club, at churches, at fraternity houses. I mean, just the wide range, because we wanted it to be accessible. There's the excuse that no one shows up, but we wanted to make sure that wasn't the case. So we went to where people were, and when needed, we gave people money, bus tokens, whatever they needed to do to get there. And I'm just going to throw this out, the last thing about defending your study. So I'm in Chicago. Our very first focus group was on the far south side of Chicago. It was the coldest day of the year at that point. I think it was about 10 degrees below zero. And where we were located is not off of a major L line, but you can get there through an L and a bus or a couple buses. And we only had 2 participants show up to the study. I was impressed that they showed up. It was freezing. So it's not far from where I live, but for some people, it was in their neighborhood, but it still can take some time to get there, and it was freezing. So when we turned in our first report to our IRB, it was, why did only 2 people show up? And the underlying question was, is this not an important enough study? And I had to say, and let me just say I'm on the IRB now for many reasons, but let me just say before I completely bash them. But I had to justify, it's not why didn't more show up, it's the fact that these 2 did show up. It is cold, and they felt their experiences were important enough to show up on the coldest day of the year to share with us their stories. And we ended up hosting a second group in that community where we had more than enough people show up. But I throw that out to say that you will often get questioned about the validation and the purpose of the work, and it's looked at from a negative perspective. And so, you know, my advice is that your job is to point out the positive value of what people who are participating, what they think. I don't care if it's one person, that one person is important. And so, you know, we got past that, but I was shocked at the question, why were there only 2 people? And I thought, I'm thrilled 2 people showed up. Are you kidding me? This is great. We're off to a good start. This is going to be a good 3 years. So.
I love that story. Thank you, Henrika. And I love how everybody, you know, all of us and everybody in the chat is already uplifting each other's work, and it seems like we're all fighting the good fight to make this work happen and be heard and respected. And so my last question is actually similar to that. So how can this research be applied and used and as useful as it can be? So while our panel responds, I also invite the practitioners and policymakers in the audience to chat about how they've used or want to use this kind of research. So starting with Carolyn, how can this research that illuminates victims' perspectives of justice inform current calls to transform the justice system, particularly?
What my next project will be, and I'm just starting that with the YWCA in Seattle in the prosecutor's office, I realized that oftentimes who calls me is defense after a survivor has used violence or killed an intimate partner. And then they want me to come in and sort of be an expert and talk about these dynamics. And I just thought, well, what better way how can we avoid having them be in the criminal legal system in the first place? So my new project that I'm starting to work on now is to start to work with prosecutors to educate them about how the dynamics of domestic violence puts survivors into the system in the first place. They're using the violence in self-defense. They're committing other crimes to try to escape the violence. So how can we do more education with prosecutors and people in the legal system to help avoid some of that in terms of how they're being managed? And how can we use community resources to help survivors? Because too often the systems are set up, it's like, okay, this is what we have to offer and this is what we can do for you, rather than asking survivors what it is that they need. And helping, is it help with rent? Is it help getting your car fixed? Is it help first month's rent? How can we better articulate what survivors need in providing that, rather than just saying, we know what's best for you? And the other project that I'm working on is really articulating a model for helping advocates understand that it's not just intimate partner violence and sexual assault, but it is how can we bring all the areas of violence, historical trauma, structural and institutional violence, and how does that layer on top of each other? How does that intersect in the lives of victims, so we can talk about violence in a way that really reflects their experiences? So those are the 2 projects that I'm working on right now to better do that.
Wonderful. That's excellent to hear. I'm thrilled for that work. Henrika, would you like to share next?
Sure. So, you know, I would say the first thing I think is that if you're not including your participants in thinking about the type of funding, then you're likely going to fund the wrong thing, right? I see this so often in terms of people have questions and the questions aren't expansive enough, they aren't deep enough or broad enough, because you haven't actually asked people who are experiencing what you're interested in, what is important. And so I think it's very important to think about how this type of research, when it's participatory, can transform what it is that we're asking and then ultimately what it is that we learn. You know, I mean, we try to help researchers understand, which is something practitioners often know. And I'm a social worker, I was a clinician for years, so I kind of approach this from that perspective, that just like my clients are experts of their lives, participants are experts. And so we have to let them inform us and then use that to guide research. And I think by doing that, we can really transform what we ask and really improve what we know. I think, the second thing, and I brought this up earlier with kind of my IRB experience, is that really correcting myths about who people are and what's important and how they're impacted. I made notes. It was interesting. I brought up the military violence piece earlier, but there's so many things that we miss, like talking about experiences for people in the military, intimate partner violence for men, sexual assault for men. It was interesting. And I said we had all men doing interviews, and we did a lot of debriefing with our interviewers, even though they were around the country. We brought them to Chicago a couple times, and many of them often said, even though they went into this having their own ideas about what happened to young men and having their own experiences, they were even surprised. And so we have to understand that experiences are vast, and that we have to then really do a good job of understanding what the questions are and asking the right thing. Because if not, we're just going to continue to get surface level information that doesn't transform anything, and we'll just continue to see, I think, issues perpetuated. And that kind of defeats the purpose of doing, I think, really good work. So.
Thank you so much. Jeanette, how do you think this research in particular can be used to inform policymakers and practitioners' work?
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts, and they, some of them are kind of dovetail off of what Carolyn said. But I mean, I'm aware that, or I'm also like working on another project right now that's a TTA effort on working with courts across the country to provide education around issues of human trafficking. And I just want to like say that I think those efforts are really important, and that education and awareness around issues of trafficking or other victimization are important, but should always also involve service providers and survivors as having a voice in those kind of trainings and awareness efforts. And that it just shouldn't always just be researchers or people in power coming in to do those kinds of training, and they should be informed. And sometimes I see that happen and other times I don't. And I just want to say it out loud. I think that's really important. I also think that, I've done some work around human trafficking task forces, and I know that, just thinking about the way the criminal justice system responds to cases of human trafficking, and that in most cases, in order to push through a case of human trafficking, the victim has to be cooperative in that. And they have to, and many times agree to make a statement or to come into court. And I don't feel like we've really progressed as a criminal justice system of finding ways to like push forward cases, or to think about how to hold individuals accountable without needing a victim to be a part of that case if they're not interested in doing that, if we are interested in holding those individuals accountable. And so just trying to think about how to be more victim-centered or trauma-informed, or be creative and respectful of individuals who don't want to be involved in the court case. And then just to think, I think we're all, the country is questioning whether we should be diverting more funds away from the criminal justice system into service provision. And, a huge finding of our project was survivors themselves saying that they should be, we shouldn't be thinking reactively to trafficking in particular. We should be thinking proactively, and we should be investing money in social services and educational programs and awareness programs, and putting money back into the community to try to, stop issues before they arise. And so that would, I think that's a conversation that we're having out there right now. And I think it's a great conversation to have, and just to be thinking of alternatives to the criminal justice system.
Wonderful. That's excellent. Thank you. I appreciate hearing from all of you. And I obviously could ask you guys questions and continue my personal conversation with you all day, but there's been a lot of engagement in the chat, which I'm thrilled to see. And so I would love to ask of you some of the questions that our wonderful audience members have posed. So I've seen kind of peripherally some multiple points of discussion about the importance of, basing research questions on with input from the people who are actually going to be the subjects of the research, involving service providers, and really being engaged in the communities in which you're working. So I would love to hear some more from any of the three of you or all of you about your experience doing participatory research or community-based research and evaluation with violence survivors in this context. I think there's a lot of interest in that kind of approach. So I'm not sure who wants to start.
Well, I'll go. I mean, I think for our project, and I think all the work I've done there, I could not do it without participants giving us, their support and feedback and information and encouragement and direction. I was always very clear that I'm a Black woman. I have experiences as someone who's Black, but I have no idea what it really feels like to be a Black male. And although the majority of my research and a lot of my clinical experiences with Black men, I would be the wrong person to think that I could really come up with adequately all the questions that needed to be asked, and would be the wrong person to be the one out leading and doing the interviewing about this particular topic, because who knows who I might be representing to the young men who are participating. I could be a girlfriend or a wife or a mother or someone who'd been an abuser at some point. So, I think for us, it was important to get their information, to have them engaged, give us the direction, the things that maybe we thought were important, to let them tell us where in the hierarchy it should be important, should it not be important. We kind of approached our project from a life calendar perspective of 0 through the age that they were, and thought that would be the right thing to do, but weren't sure. So we, asked them that question. And we ultimately ended up with an instrument where it's over 600 pages. And participants had to, for our study purposes, pick 2 traumas or experiences that they wanted to focus on. But the goal was that, at any point, anyone could pick any one of those and it should be equally valid. But we wanted to know, was that important to have that opportunity? We needed them to tell us how it should be structured. If us asking about, did you have insurance or not, and lose your employment, and did you talk to a coach, etc., those were things that we thought important, but we need to tell them, have them tell us the other things we should be asking, like, how did that impact your relationship with your sibling? How did that impact your ability to continue your relationship with your child's mom, etc.? So at least from my perspective, I don't think our work would certainly be as rich if we had not included our participants and those who were the focus of the work in the work. And I don't think, I wouldn't have done it that way, but I also just think it would not be a good study if it were done that way. So.
Thank you. Carolyn or Jeanette, do you have any advice for people looking to better center the community within their work, or other examples of how you've done it yourself?
Well, I can just say, I think, on the project, the trafficking project, talk with specifically, that was, absolutely right. What Henrico was saying. We had an advisory group that, included survivors, of labor trafficking, sex trafficking, service providers. We spent several days together going through an instrument, and we pilot tested it. But even that, like, each step along the way, each interview we did, we took a step back after that interview, off of the recording, and said, how did that go for you? And we were always getting feedback, like, how did that feel for you? Or what was that like for you? And, if it was upsetting, like, tell us how to improve, like, even like a consent process, right? Consent processes can be really hard and cumbersome to go through. And just like, always getting feedback along the way and trying to integrate that as best as we could, and just to be respectful about that experience moving along, and being responsive to that. And that's just like so important, because, we don't have that experience, and we need to hear what how other people are in that moment, and what they're saying, saying to us in response.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that is just having worked in universities for 30 plus years, just making sure that the research we do doesn't harm the community. It's just the most crucial thing. I think that there's real reasons why people are so reluctant sometimes to engage in research, because too often it has benefited the scholars who use it to get tenure and promotion, but it doesn't seem to always benefit the people who are the participants, and making sure that we're also doing what we need to do to listen to their voices and center their voices. So that's just so crucial.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for putting that point so eloquently. We really, especially all of us at CVR, really, I can say with certainty, I completely agree. So my former colleague, Cameron, great to see you, Cameron, asked, have any of you seen any solid models of interlocking relationships between structural violence and cycles of interpersonal violence? In addition to that, there's been a number of comments about the importance of intergenerational trauma. So we'd love to get your thoughts on those topics, please.
I guess I'll just briefly say about that. I just finished a book chapter on that very topic. And if I could maybe send it to you and you could share it with anybody, or you can also reach me through my website. I'll be happy to share that with people as well, because that has been, again, it goes back to producing the material that you want to see. And I think particularly with everything that's going on in the culture, it's making us have to have conversations about intergenerational trauma, structural trauma, and how all those things are interrelated. And I just think that we need to very quickly pivot to doing that and including all of that in the work that we do, if we're going to do this work in any way that's going to be meaningful. So I'd be happy to share anything that I've been doing.
We will definitely make sure to include that link when we send out the recording and slides from today, if people are interested and you're willing to have that go out.
So I'll say I just added a link to the chat function. We have a Center for Health Equity Research at UIC that's really focused on structural violence and funds projects in that area. Is a community-based center that we have. So I included a link there because I think that's certainly a great place to look for models like that and to connect to people. They offer, funding for community partners as well as researchers, and the requirement is that they work together. And so, it's not a lot of money, but you get, university support and a researcher to help with that. And I've been on the review panel, as well as I'm serving as a mentor this year for 2 faculty members who are working with a community partner. And so they're interested in kind of examining things like structural violence and interpersonal violence and how those things connect, et cetera. So for me personally, it's not my own particular area of research, but that's certainly a group that is very committed to that. It's been funded federally to do this. And they run funding, I think 2 to 3 times a year. So I've included that link that can go out, and I think it's a great place. And the people that are engaged in that are very committed and I think open to working with people around the country. So I'd encourage people to look at that link. And if there's any questions about people there, people can always email me as well, but that link is available.
Excellent, that's super exciting. I would love to hear a little bit more about how we can ensure that information generated from this research is accessible for service providers and the affected communities. So how do we translate it into something that's actionable and accessible? All 3 of you have touched on that a little bit, but if you have any more thoughts to share, that would be wonderful.
So I'll just say briefly what I've done with the last couple of projects that I've had is to purposely carve out money to create our own project websites. Because when you're relying on the federal government or whoever your funder is, that might no longer be a priority. I'll say for my last 2 federally funded programs or projects, neither is a priority. One was on LGBTQ youth who were experiencing life without housing. And when there was administration change, that quickly disappeared from the website. But fortunately, we created our own website that will be housed for at least 10 years, and we've put everything there. And for Survive, because we're still kind of at the beginning stages of finally getting to disseminate our work as we experience a transition in governmental leadership, this project too became no longer a priority. But what we did was use part of that money to create our own website, which is where we're planning to house everything from our instrument to all of our products. And so I would say that's one way to do that. It doesn't have, we hired someone, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be one that someone creates for $500 to put things. And so I think there's always a way to do it. There's no disincentive to do that. And so it might be minor, but that's one way we wanted to make sure that people had access. We also, for the first project, printed out hard copies for things. My office is full of hundreds of executive reports and summaries and full reports, et cetera, that when people want them, I'm happy to mail them. So I think those are two ways that you can do that make them, and the language is also non-researchy. That was the other point of it. So I would say those are two things that we've done that I think can certainly be done by people from a low-end budget to a high-end budget.
Thank you so much. And everybody will make sure to include the link that Henrika mentioned when we send out all the event resources afterwards.
I can just second Henrika's point. We did the exact same. Totally understand about the federal funding and restrictions around that and the limitations that come with that. So we did exactly the same thing for our Perceptions of Justice to Human Trafficking project I've been referring to, just to make like a landing ground for that and to have a place. We spent our final products, we focused the majority of our attention to doing like short practitioner friendly briefs versus a long final report that people have to sift through, just shorter to the point briefs that people are really accessible and people can just go on the website and download them. And we've gotten a lot of great feedback, and they're easy to shoot out on email and to share with folks. And we've just and they're really fun to write, honestly, and so we've done that as well. And, we're wrapping up another project right now for just a study about the Human Trafficking Task Force. And we're going to be doing the same thing because it is a lot more accessible to everybody, I think.
Carolyn, do you have anything to add about making your research accessible and actionable?
That is just always the foundation of everything I do. So writing just in ways that are accessible, and particularly the systematic literature reviews. I just think that those are really, as the literature changes and grows, it's just making sure that that's accessible. And I try to make sure that just about everything I write is available through like my website and my personal website and other places, because if you don't have access to, university libraries, then that is just really not available to people. And that just seems wrong to me. So that's super important to me.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and plug CBR's research library at this time. Our wonderful research librarian, Laura Pulls, is on today, and we exist really to help people overcome that paywall barrier and lack of access to, university libraries. So I'll plug that for now and then move on to some other questions. So we have a couple questions about protecting perpetrators, especially maybe Jeanette during your indigent defense work, as well as if anybody's studying the prevalence of false accusations as a form of victimization. I'm not sure who wants to take that on first.
Mallory, could you repeat the question?
Sure. Okay, so we have multiple. So the first one is, with the explosion of Karen videos, is anybody studying the prevalence of false accusations as a form of victimization? Particularly, there's a concern for men recovering from false accusations in court.
So I'll just say, I don't know if anyone is. I saw that and loved that question. But what I ironically thought is that that's been going on for centuries. And so I just wrote a invited paper about it's called Black Lives Matter and Yes, You're Racist, the parallelism between the 20th and 21st centuries. And it kind of shows how what we're experiencing, Carolyn's laughing, what we're experiencing now is really reflective of what we experienced the first 60 years of the last century. And so I find that question interesting because what we're seeing now has been happening for centuries. It's just happening on video and more people know about it. And so I think that's a great topic to study. I hope someone does, but I hope what they do is also go back and look at that we can trace back to Emmett Till, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, about how false accusations have led to the deaths of Black men historically, and how that's been such a weapon of power. And just the difference now is that it's on camera and more people know about it and it's happening in this current time. So I don't know if anyone is. If someone's interested, I maybe would be interested in doing it with them, but I certainly think that there's such a historical piece to that, that I would certainly have concerns that someone would look at it without understanding the historical piece, and that Black men and Black people have lived with that hanging over their heads forever. And that the only new part is that everyone else is finding out about it. But I think it's a great topic to research. So if anyone knows anyone, put in the chat. I'm sure curious to know who they are and maybe lend a tiny bit of support that I might have to the work. So.
Thanks so much for that, Henrika. Jeanette or Carolyn, do you have anything to add on that?
I personally don't have experience with that line of research, so I'm sorry.
Jeanette, do you want to speak at all about protecting perpetrators, especially your indigent defense work at all? I'm not sure whether there's another specific question from JD about that. That's all I have. Maybe we'll put a pin in that. Let's see. So it seems like there's a lot of questions about kind of specific communities and whether people have looked at them, like Appalachian communities, victimization within military communities, et cetera. So I might let people kind of ask those specific questions in the chat, but where do you all see some of the bigger gaps in knowledge in capturing victims' voices on justice? Like, where are the gaps in different communities so far in the research?
I think a huge gaping gap for me is looking at violence in the lives of transgender women of color. Because, I'm just really arguing more and more in my work. If we really want to understand intersectionality, that would be it. Because your transphobia, racism, sexism, poverty, homelessness, just about every social problem impacts them disproportionately. And if we can create systems that could better serve them, they would better serve everybody. So if we can kind of look at the most marginalized, so I would like to see more research done there, because they're not only experiencing violence in interpersonal relationships, just about every system that they interact with, and then structural violence and just violence just about everywhere. So I think that's an area that we've got to do better, a population that we have to do better with serving.
I'll say one thing we were excited about for our study that is part of what got cut off when we had to stop our study, was that it was supposed to be focused on urban, suburban, and rural populations. And part of what we were really interested in finding out, which remember this was down before now, hate crimes is one of our categories. And we had hate crimes based on race, based on sexual orientation, a whole gamut of kind of categories. And we didn't get to do a lot of our rural areas. And it was nationwide, so we were focused on everywhere from the South, where a larger number of Blacks live, to the West, where it was much harder to kind of find the populations that we wanted. And so all that to say, I think rural populations for Blacks are less studied, although a significant number still continue to live in that environment. And those that don't often have relatives or history from that environment. I'm from Chicago. I've lived here my whole life, but my parents are from the South, and although not rural, that is, the Great Migration happened. And so there is history there, and I think that's a population that's sorely understudied. And there are unique experiences that happen there that are important, and I think if we're really explored, would really highlight in greater number some of the experiences that we see in urban environments, but people tend to write off as being an urban problem, but in fact are really deep-seated in a lot of the larger issues that expressed in rural areas, but that are hidden because of even less power that exists in those areas than they may in urban environments where there's broader representation and broader access to political opportunities, activism, et cetera. So.
And I concur, I would just say I concur with all of that, particularly from the trafficking perspective. Like, I think we lack research and our focus on even men who are trafficked, right? And I think we focus a lot of attention on women or even young girls who are sex trafficked, and not near as much focus on men who may have that experience. And individuals who are labor trafficked, the LGBTQ community. I mean, I feel like we have a ways to go and a lot of work to do in the trafficking space. Honestly, the rural areas, a lot of our focus is in the community, in the urban communities right now. And we know that once you start getting out of the urban communities, people really struggle, law enforcement struggles to even understand what trafficking is, what victimization looks like in that space. They misrepresent, they have all kinds of misrepresentations, and they don't even of who victims are. Service providers aren't available, or don't understand specifically what trafficking is. And so I think there are all kinds of gaps that we can continue to focus on and still need to put a lot of effort into.
So for Jeanette and Henrika, who developed these instruments and protocols for interviewing and doing focus groups with your populations of focus, do you think those tools that you've developed can be used with other populations, other types of victims, or what's going to happen with those instruments that you've developed?
I'll say, I think ours can. I mean, we started with, Carolyn brought this up, we started with the research first. So we started doing a survey of all of the instruments that were out in the world that were focused on people who've been victimized by violence from 0 through our age group. But we were also interested then in identifying the categories that would be most likely to be impactful for this particular population. But there's nothing about them that necessarily makes them uniquely only young Black men 18 to 24. It just purposely includes categories that might be particular to them that they thought were important. But I think certainly it's and we made it purposely for practitioners and researchers. As someone who had both experiences, I felt that was really important. And it was important that it could be ripped apart and use just one component or 5 components or whatever. And you could do the life history calendar and just do one part. So I think absolutely ours could be used in a variety of ways. It's just that we particularly thought about what are issues that should be included that were not included in other instruments for this population. But yes, absolutely.
And I can say that ours, our instruments, we did publish a final report through NIJ, and our instruments, it was qualitative. It was all of our data was collected, there was survivor voices. And so it was all in-person qualitative interviews. And the instrument that we use, it's published, it's out there. And so it's really specific to gathering information on just survivor experiences with service providers, perceptions of justice, thinking about justice in other contexts outside the criminal justice system. And so if somebody is interested in studying that or implementing that, like, absolutely, like, I think they can, you know, people can take that as even as a starting, a baseline, and kind of mold it and take it and run with it and, you know, like, make it what they want it to be. But if you're wanting to do something different, it doesn't have like standardized questions that maybe other survey instruments might have. Somebody just asked me where the instrument is available, and I can send out, I can share a link of like where our website is, and then like our final report that we'll have that has all of our interview instruments, all of our interview questions.
Great, thank you. So we have about 5 more minutes for questions with our panelists before we break out into our discussion groups. So one thing that's come up is kind of this difference between victims' perception of justice and the system's perception of justice. And Jeanette, I know you've specifically addressed kind of those differences within your study. Carolyn, I know you've, some of your work has involved, you know, working with system actors to provide more culturally sensitive services. How would you all recommend going about reconciling those differences, and how do those inform the recommendations you've made in your research?
I'm so sorry, Miller, could you say that question again?
Sure. So there's obviously a difference between the victim's perception of justice and what the justice system actors largely consider to be justice. So when you're doing research on this topic, how does that difference affect the conclusions that you come to and the recommendations you make?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it affects the I mean, we reported it. We reported all of the conclusions that we came to. I think it's awesome to like when we found differences, right, between what service providers thought about, saw as justice, what law enforcement or criminal justice actors perceived as justice in human trafficking cases, and what survivors perceived justice as justice in their cases. And that conversation wasn't out there, right? Like, that was new information. And I think, you know, for this study, it was a first of its kind study, and just putting that information out there starts a conversation. And I think that's really important. And that's, you know, where things, you know, that's where we need to begin. Sometimes is just like getting that information out there to start a conversation between different actors, and like kind of planting those seeds of recommendations that survive, you know, planting those seeds for conversations and where transformations need to occur, and where the criminal justice system may be falling short, or, you know, or vice versa. And so I think that's where research can be really awesome. And then picking it up and deciding what the next step is and who needs to lead that next step and what that looks like. So that's what's really cool about what, you know, I think like some of the work that's like we did and others are doing.
Awesome, thank you. So Lisa just asked, how can you incorporate victims' voices in deciding a research agenda? And I think that is an excellent one for us to end on. So yeah, once again, how can you incorporate victims' voices in deciding a research agenda?
I'll just say, oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Caroline. I just spoke. I could just like keep.
I guess I would, for me, it's just so simple, is that those are the voices we should just be listening to first, rather than, and I think that is part of it, is that too often the experts have sometimes come to the discussion as if we know what's best, and we're almost not even listening to those voices. So that should be at the forefront of everything we do from the very beginning of any research project, that their voices should be shaping the instruments, the questions that we ask. We should be in true partnership with them. But I'll stop and I'll let Henrika jump in here.
I was going to say, and it's actually not related to this project. My dissertation was a measurement-oriented project where I was looking at the MACI-2, which is the most widely used mental health screening tool for juvenile offenders, and it's used in 48 states. It's used throughout the world, and there was some research that showed that it was not demonstrating appropriate use across gender and across race. And so my dissertation, I've always been interested in young men, so I looked at young Black men, young white men, and did interviewing with them, like, what is it that you're interpreting, to show how they were misinterpreting information and how this was negatively impacting the experiences for young Black men moving through the justice system. So I bring that example up to say that because of those conversations with them, I was able to go back to facilities and say, look, young men are saying this is what's wrong with this. You know, these are the changes that you have to make. And so it's not that they could necessarily change the instrument, but what they did do is think about how to change the administration practice. And so as opposed to, it's a very easy 52 yes or no item. When I was a doc student, I administered to my friends, we were all off the charts on it. So we all clearly needed to be in some detention facility somewhere, right? And so part of it was how you're understanding the language and not understanding what you're actually asking. And so it was information from those young men who participated, I think, that really helped to formulate those changes. And so I think that is really important, that you have those conversations, explore that, and then use that to help change the narrative. So what those facilities did was come up with a common dictionary, so that when young men ask questions about what does this mean, they're not getting 5 different answers and then answering the question in 5 different ways. And then you have kids answering the wrong way. I'll just give one of my favorite examples. There's a question that says, have you seen things that are not there? Well, the question goes to thought disturbance, but the first kid and they didn't have to tell me their answers, but invariably they were, 12 to 17, and they did. And the first kid says to me, yes, my brother said there wasn't a soda in the refrigerator and there was one there, and he put a yes on the screener. I mean, he got a point for having a thought disturbance. He didn't have a thought disturbance. He saw a soda in the refrigerator. And so it's having conversations like that that can really correct things and have much more appropriate utility in the real world. So I'll leave it at that. It's one of my favorite. I have a few of those, but that's by far my favorite description of why we need to listen to our participants when we're making these decisions. So.
Great, I appreciate that story. Jeanette, do you have any last comment on that before we split up into breakout groups?
No, I agree with what they both said. I was also just going to say that I think it's really important when you're collaborating with service providers. I think it's important to listen to victims or survivors, but also to listen to service providers when you're partnering on research projects or any kind of collaboration, to ask them, what they think important questions are, what they see as the issues in the research. And, I think sometimes researchers can just plow through and come up with a research question and a research design and, hope, and bring a service provider on board. So I just think there's that collaboration. Service providers bring so much to the table, and always trying to integrate, what questions they are interested in asking and where they see the needed research needs in the field as well, as I think is important.
Thank you so much to everybody for asking questions and to our panelists for answering questions. I know I've loved hearing from all of you and learned so much, and I can't wait to dive into all the resources you've shared. And I know everybody else has so much else to say and other resources to share as well. So we're going to take about half an hour to split into breakout groups. Jennifer, if you would pull up the slide for a second. We have 8 groups led by the 3 panelists here, as well as 5 additional experts. Once you're in the group, feel free to switch from the speaker view to the gallery view so that you can see everybody else's faces, and to unmute yourself when you're interested in participating. The groups will close out automatically and bring you back to the main room to conclude the event. Welcome back. Hopefully you can hear me. Let's see, I think everyone is coming on back. I'm not sure, let's see if I can, there we go. Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me at this point. I hope you all have had fruitful and engaging discussions with your peers. I know there was some technological snafus with getting into the breakouts, but this is our first time doing this, so we appreciate your patience and hope you're able to connect and share information and words of wisdom regardless of who is in your group. I'm curious to hear how everybody's discussion went. So at this time, I'd love for our CVR co-facilitators to share in the chat one key takeaway or interesting discussion point from your group while I kind of start to wrap things up. If Jennifer is back, if she could share those final concluding slides, that would be wonderful. But if, oh yeah, great, there we go. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, excellent. So I just want to finish off by highlighting some of the ways that CVR can help foster or lift up this type of essential knowledge. We've mentioned some of them throughout the day, but I wanted to highlight specifically our researcher directory. We offer, it's a one-of-a-kind researcher directory that can be searched by state, researcher victimization expertise, victimization focus, research expertise, etc. So if you are a researcher and are not in it, we encourage you to join. If you are in our researcher directory or have used it before, go ahead and give me a thumbs up, maybe, if you're able. Yeah, we also have produced a number of original tools to support these partnerships, like quick reference guides on creating MOUs, how academic researchers can do more of that community engaged research and partnership, as well as tips for protecting victims in research, which I think is particularly appropriate for today's conversation. I mentioned we have a robust library that contains a catalog of victim research data collection instruments, as well as research articles. And so please, we'd love for people to use that to find what they're looking for. And if you have your own research that you would like us to add to it, please feel free to share that with us as well. And then we also use our library podcasts and webinars to uplift and highlight existing researcher practitioner partnerships around the country. So we're always looking for new ones to highlight and share out. So I think that's about it. Oh, and for the practitioners in the audience, we do offer free research-focused technical assistance. So while my colleague puts up our exit poll and people continue to add things from the breakout groups to the chat, I want to conclude by thanking our very esteemed panelists today, as well as our great discussion group leaders for their insight and contributions. And thank every one of you for taking the time to join us today for this very interesting, important, and timely conversation. Feel free to share something in the chat about one thing that you learned or appreciated hearing about today. We love hearing that kind of engagement. And we hope that you've been able to share some of your work and make some new connections, and that these conversations extend long beyond today. So in fact, the conversation today is going to result in a written brief that highlights the takeaways from the event, including some of the research shared, the gaps and challenges identified, and strategies for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers alike. We will also share the recording and slides from today and the brief when it's completed. So thank you very much once again, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Okay, I just realized no one can hear me. I was going to say that I know we can stop the recording, but I don't want to lose the chat. I think Jason assured me that it would be saved.